Yeah, good morning, everyone. And good morning to members and colleagues and stakeholders at the Argentine Beef Promotion Institute. I'm Joel Haggard, the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Meat Export Federation. I'm sitting in Hong Kong this morning. It's very hot here. And today I'm going to share with you some thoughts about the Asian beef markets with a particular focus on China. And for this talk, I'm going to talk about the general situation in Asia for the beef markets. And then I'm going to talk about the situation as we look at the markets in terms of the US producer perspective. So I hope you find the talk interesting. And again, I wish you a very successful conference. So this morning, I'm going to start with a summary of my kind of conclusions of where the beef markets are. So first, despite the weak economies and the hard-hit food service sectors in Asia, beef imports actually for the first half of this year have performed better than expected. A lot of that has to do with the China situation, where African swine fever has taken out up to 20 million tons of pork production, and this is driving record imports of beef, pork, poultry, and sheep meat. And ASF, African swine fever, is accelerating a long-term steady increase in China per capita beef consumption. And this increased beef consumption we're going to see in the future is being driven by imports, not so much by domestic production. From the US perspective, China is a very attractive market, but it's really not one of our major export destinations like it is for Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and Australia. We believe that US beef exports to China are going to grow slowly, and they're going to grow slowly because the percentage of grain-fed beef consumption is still low, but it's going to grow in the long term. But as being an Americans, I think everyone is aware that the relationship between China and the US is very fragile at the moment. It's possible that our trade could be disrupted by a further deterioration in the trade, in the relationship. And all US agricultural exports face these risks, not just that for beef. So first, it's very important to begin this talk by talking a little bit about the COVID-19 virus situation in Asia. And I won't go through all the situation in Asia, but just in summary, the situation here is still somewhat fragile. There's still outbreaks in many of the countries. The country that has the situation most under control is China, but they're still experiencing some outbreaks, like the one in the far west that started in middle of July. Here in Hong Kong, we're having a third wave of infections. Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and Philippines are still being hit very hard. So the only two areas that are really have the COVID infections completely under control and suppressed are Taiwan and New Zealand. So this is creating continued uncertainty in the region, and it's going to continue to drive uncertainty for the economies of these regions. So earlier in the spring, the World Bank and the IMF came up with forecasts for how the Asian economies will perform this year. They were pretty terrible forecasts, but those forecasts are actually getting worse, except for a few areas. China's one of them. During Q2 2020, China just published its Q2 numbers, and they came in at 3.2% positive. That's after a minus 6% reduction during Q1. That was January through March in China. Almost the whole country was under lockdown. Almost every restaurant in China was closed down. but they really bounced back, started to bounce back in April, and they turned in a positive economic performance during the second quarter. The only other economy that's large economy in Asia that's doing well at the moment is Vietnam. All these economies, though, are shut off from international travel, but Vietnam and some of the smaller Mekong Delta River economies, Laos and Cambodia, they'll probably perform positively this year. But for the rest of the economies, Korea, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, it looks like a pretty dismal performance. So as I said earlier, when COVID first hit China in February, we were extremely worried as it began to spread beyond its borders to Japan and Korea and to Taiwan and here in Hong Kong, that the food service industry would be hit very hard by the epidemic. And because most beef imports, at least American beef imports, that are imported into our biggest markets, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and here in Hong Kong, they go into the food service industry. More than 50%, we estimate, of American beef into Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan go into the food service industry. But as you see from this chart, quite contrary to our expectations, Asian beef imports have been relatively stable during this pandemic's first wave. Of course, China, the imports are being driven by African swine fever. Even though China's restaurants were entirely shut down for 6 weeks to 8 weeks and are still suffering, beef imports are growing, and that is because of very strong retail sales, which I'm going to explain later. But even in Japan and Korea, imports have stayed pretty high. The pace of total beef imports into Japan through May are taking place at a record pace. Korea, the second fastest velocity of beef imports ever. There is a drop in Hong Kong imports, but not because of the food service industry, more because of more exporters, including from your country, are shipping direct to China rather than shipping to Hong Kong. Southeast Asia has been hit by COVID, but it's more of a supply issue because when India went into lockdown in March, much of its beef production and processing industry was locked down as well. They could not export to Philippines and Indonesia, and so that accounts for a lot of the decline in imports into the Southeast Asian countries, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And Taiwan's a small importer, but record imports again this year. So, and they've been the least affected by the COVID shutdown. So just from the US perspective, so everyone understands, because in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, China's your big market. But for the United States, it only accounts for 1% of our exports so far this year, 1 to 2%. Yes, it's growing, but as I will explain later, China is a very new market to us. We've really only had what we call unrestricted access to the market since around February of this year. And when we got the access, that's when China was shutting down. But Asia, the rest of Asia, accounts for 62% of our US beef export volume and 70% of our total value. And just two markets, Japan and Korea, account for 48% of the value of total US beef exports, which every year are around $8 billion or 1.25 million metric tons. So, but as we move forward this year, we see a very positive market situation for US beef throughout Asia. Not so much in China, because that's going to be a slower growth. I'm going to explain that in a second. But if you look at carcass prices, and this is for the week of a little bit earlier this month, the week of July 8th, you saw that the Australian prices are now among all major exporting countries the highest. And the United States competes with Australia the most directly in these grain-fed markets. 27% of Australia's total beef exports are in grain-fed. Almost all United States beef exported to Asia and anywhere is grain-fed. So our principal competitor in Asia, especially Japan and Korea and Taiwan, is Australia. So this is important to keep in mind when we start talking about China, where grain-fed beef is still a very small percentage of total consumption. Okay, so let's first talk about Japan. I think some of you may have heard that through last year, the United States was facing a duty disadvantage in comparison with Australia and Canada and New Zealand, our principal competitors, because the United States did not join the free trade agreement, the CPTPP, but late last year, the United States and Japan signed a bilateral agreement, and that saw the beef import duties on US beef decline when that agreement went into effect earlier this year from 38.5% to what is now 25.8%. So the beef duties that we pay into Japan right now are the same as Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, and Mexico. So we're starting to take back share. As you can see from this graph, the United States and Australia are the principal suppliers to Japan. It's our most valuable market. About 28% of the value of total US beef exports are for Japan. It's a market that we started developing in the early 1980s. 50% of what we export to Japan is chilled product. The cuts, mainly, it's a narrower range of cuts, but it's short plate for what they call the beef bowl, chuck rolls, and Korean and Japanese barbecue cuts, some loin items, but basically short ribs, but basically it's a narrow range of cuts. But keep in mind that about half of that business is chilled, and we can ship product to Japan in chilled form in about 2 to 3 weeks. Korea has been one of the markets, been growing. It's our second largest market by value. The market opened in the 1990s. The US had a very small market share. It was mainly a grass-fed market, but over these last couple decades, it's grown into more of a grain-fed market. Australia exports are similar to the United States, but they've been in decline because Korea, like some of these other Asian markets, are becoming more attuned to grain-fed beef. 33% of Australia's total beef exports to Korea are grain-fed, but it's 100% for the United States. Like Japan, it's a small range of cuts. About half of what we export to Korea are rib items, chuck short rib, beef short rib, bone-in, boneless, rib finger meat, and we also export a lot of chuck roll to Korea, where they marinate it and they cook it on Korean barbecue. This is important because some of these beef consumption trends are also developing in China. But Korea is our second largest export value market. It's held pretty strong this year in terms of its imports, and it has managed to control the virus, keep its restaurants open. Korea never locked down, and so its food service industry has been much stronger than some of the markets in Southeast Asia. Okay, so let's talk about China for the rest of the presentation. So as I said earlier, even though China locked down in February and March, the decline in pork production in China, which accounts for about 2/3 of total red meat consumption, the decline in pork production in China has been close to 20 million tons. So China has been trying to import more protein from everywhere, from your country, from Australia, Uruguay, Brazil, New Zealand, Canada. The United States is a small player because we're at the very high price point for that commodity beef, but still we're seeing the demand. But if you look at the total imports of protein, this year China could do an amazing 10 million tons of total pork, beef, poultry, and sheep meat. And if you think of that, only in 2018, they were around 4 million tons. It's possible this year they will add 6 million tons of meat and poultry imports. Beef imports into China are going to go up. They're already near 1 million tons for January, June. They're rising extremely fast. You can see the numbers here. In Argentina, you can see your exports are up 50%. Brazil is up, Australia, everyone's up into China. 90% of those beef imports are grass-fed, about 10% are grain-fed. Australia exports about 27% of its beef to China in the grain-fed format. That is growing. China's importing more Wagyu, but still, compared to Japan and Korea, only 10% of China's beef imports, about 10%, are grain-fed. And so beef importing into China, it's still very much price-driven, as I think many of you know. You know the cuts better than I do. The market changes daily. It's all about price. It's all about supply. Is your plan approved? And what are the port conditions? So it's a very big market. The imports are going to stay strong this year. I think beef consumption is going to continue to increase. Will the beef imports reach 2 million tons this year, which would be double than 2019? That remains to be seen, but still, the increase is just phenomenal. So these are the current market conditions as we see them. I think many of you know, you've heard that warehouses in China are full. They're testing for COVID on meat packaging and on the meat itself. You can see the picture there of someone taking a test for COVID on a beef sample. This has slowed down the clearance of product, but in recent days, they've lowered the testing rate on COVID. So there's been this backlog of product in the ports. It's starting to unlock a little bit. You saw how much meat and poultry has come into China. The volumes are huge. The freezers are full. Even though China has massive amounts of cold storage capacity, it's really near capacity, and it's been slow to get those products moved out into the market. But we think it's going to get better in the coming months as these inspections at the port start to clear. Of course, though, you see that China's delisted many plants. There's been plants delisted from Argentina, United States, Brazil, Germany. The list there is on the right. Importers and wholesalers are nervous over these plant suspensions. If you have product on the water and it gets, and all of a sudden there's a ban put in place, that product really loses a lot of value. The other thing China is dealing with this summer is heavy flooding. That's affected the movement of product around the country and logistics, and it's also influenced demand. People have had to stay indoors. So the flooding has continued through the end of July, and this has created some backlogs as well. So there was a lot of coverage in the press in China earlier about the COVID and the fact that maybe imported meat and seafood could spread it. But that media coverage of that is now declining. That's why we're seeing less media coverage of that, of course, but also less testing. So the wholesale product movement, beef, pork, poultry, it's getting a little bit better at the end of July. The other reason that the imported meat is getting a little bit better, and it's the very hot part of the summer, so demand is a little bit down. But pork prices in China, because of that decline in supply, are still very, very high. Through June, those prices climbed another 12%. China has some of the highest pork prices in the world. The price of a live hog in China is 8 times the price of that in the United States. So for the US, China is still a very small market. I won't go too much into detail on all this, but the US and China did sign this phase 1 trade deal. It gave us a lot of concessions. We had a problem in China with the hormone issue, because in the United States, we do use hormones for our beef production. China agreed to drop that ban, but it still has a ban on another feed additive we use in the United States called ractopamine. So it still requires in the United States a special supply chain to supply beef to China. We still have to have a unique supply chain that consists of ractopamine-free cattle to supply to China. So we're still trying to build up that capacity. That's why our volumes to China are still very small, just a couple thousand tons a week. Plus, we're grain-fed. We have the highest prices among all suppliers. Our products really consist of a narrow range of items for hot pot and Korean barbecue. We're more competitive on these type of items that are good for grilling and hot pot and Korean barbecue, like short ribs, the middle meats, the steak cuts, short plate, chuck rolls, but we're less competitive on the hind quarter cuts. You can see those on the right, shin shank. On price, we just can't compete with you guys. And so US beef in China moves through very different channels. So Brazil, Argentina beef, a lot of Australian beef, it moves through those wholesale markets shown on the bottom of the screen, where the US beef moves through a kind of a different system than the wholesale market system. Our product goes to importers who generally distribute direct to hotels and premium retail. So in terms of beef consumption patterns in China, we see that there's a change in consumer preferences, and slowly consumers in China are embracing beef meals like hot pot, barbecue, and steak compared to traditional stews. So as you saw earlier, you heard earlier, still 90% of beef consumption in China is grass-fed product for the imports. But there's more hot pot restaurants, barbecue, and steak restaurants proliferating in China, and this is driving the demand for more grain-fed beef. But this will be a long-term process. In Taiwan, which has consumer profile very much like China, this took decades to unfold. And so for us, for our beef producers, we do not see a quick gain for the China market. It will grow slowly over many years, but it'll be driven by these slow, organic moving trends like the increase in hot pot, Korean barbecue, and steak consumption. But beef in China explodes as a category. Up until about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you did not see much beef in supermarkets. But over the last couple of years, especially because of the shortage of pork, you see beef everywhere in supermarkets, being sold like this, but also being sold like on the right-hand side, very nicely packaged. The retail merchandising of beef, it still needs work. If you visit Shanghai and Beijing and go to supermarkets, the beef merchandising looks really good. But if you go to other parts of the country where most of the population lives, you may see beef displays that look more like that on the left side. But it's improving very rapidly. And so the Chinese are learning very fast, watching Japan, Korea, and Taiwan how to merchandise beef. And this is driving the consumer to consume more beef because it looks more attractive. And then finally, my last slide and my last thought, e-commerce. So e-commerce is growing very fast in China. Last year, of all retail sales of everything, not just food, but clothing and electronics, e-commerce accounted for 20% of all retail sales. But in terms of fresh food, it only accounted for 6% of sales. So in terms of the sales of meat on e-commerce, it's still very, very small. But during this virus outbreak, of course, people are locked down. What do? They get online and they shop. And so this is the type of beef items you can buy online. If you can see the right hand of the screen with a circle around it, you can see an Argentine beef item there. It's sold out. You need to send more. You need to put more Argentine beef on the e-commerce channels. But this e-commerce channels, they're growing very fast. The estimates for this year, because of the virus outbreak, fresh food sales online will grow over 60% this year. So this is a channel that's very small. It's growing fast. And as you look to expand the distribution channels for your product, please look at e-commerce. And that concludes my presentation. And I really thank you for joining me today.